Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, the live streaming is a little bit different. So let me just set this all up. How is everyone doing today? So today's going to be a two-part. So this is going to be part one, and then our second portion of this topic will happen next Monday at noon. So stay tuned for the second part if you found today's discussion rewarding. All right. Let me just get the poll set up here. Geez, this is so confusing. Give me 1 second here. Polls. Ooh, okay, I got it now. Hello, everyone. My name is Shiloh. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Affirming Ministries Coordinator of Edmonton, based out of the Robertson Wesley United Church. Today, we're going to be talking about part one of the inclusive marriage theology. In order to kind of talk about marriage as a whole, when we're talking about LGBTQ folks, I'm going to start off by talking about some of the clobber passages that are found in the Bible that conservative Christians use against LGBTQ folks. So, as we start, I'm going to throw up a poll question here. You may be able to see it there on the screen. And so the question asks, how many scriptures talk about homosexuality? So you have four options there: 0, 3, 6, and 10. Hello, Pan. So we'll wait to see anyone votes here. Well, got one person voting 10. That's great. I'll give you about 10 more seconds to vote. Hello, Britt. Two votes for 10. All right. So let's show results here. Perfect. So we got two votes for 10. So the question was, how many scriptures talk about homosexuality? If we're talking about homosexuality explicitly, the correct answer was 6. Um, Although there are a few verses that people use to condemn homosexuality, such as Genesis 1:27, which can be added, but explicitly referring to homosexual sexual acts, there are actually only 6. I mean, I could also do it as a trick question and say technically none, just because a lot of the stuff that they talk about is not considered um, homosexuality as we know it. Um, so technically it could be 0, but for all terms and purposes, the verses that do reference homosexual sexual acts, there are only 6. I'm actually going to jump right into it. So the first verse that I want to kind of talk about is Genesis 1:27. I talk about this verse a lot in my trans theology workshops. Um, and many of you know the verse that says, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." And so this one gets used a lot for both queer and trans folks, just because of the idea of this gender binary of God making man and woman. And so inherently, people have to be either male or female, or inherently that both male and female persons have to come together in a marriage or in a relationship. So that's kind of the backbone of why this verse is used. My response to that is that the creation story in Genesis is actually was written as an ancient poem. And so the poem had a theme of this duality of creation. And we see that throughout the entirety of the chapter, where God creates a lot of other binary spaces, such as creating night and day, the sun and the moon, land and water. Yet we see in our world that we have a lot of combinations of these binary, such as dawn and dusk, tidal zones, and there are many different creatures that fall into their own category, such as platypuses, um, because they don't fit in any category that we've given them before. And so you would argue that these in-between spaces, such as platypus or dusk and dawn, are a result of the fall because they don't fit the binary. Yet they say that humans do. And so for me, humans can also be deviant of these major categories that are found in Genesis. But it's not, it doesn't speak for the exceptions. It only talks about the rules that they have. And so for me, I personally think that these chapters in Genesis have given way too much emphasis. It is a history story, it is not a history book. So pretty much Genesis just idolizes the way things are meant to be, um, or justify the things that are meant to be. Whereas I see it as um, just a poem. It's essentially a poem of creation and how humans, um, through God, see how humans are created. Also, I do feel like there are a lot of historical limitations to Genesis. It only contains a lot of the major categories, such as earth, water, some of the animals, but it doesn't talk about a lot of the things that were unknown at the time, such as technology or bacteria. So to say that everything in Genesis is true, I disagree. I think there's a lot of things missing in Genesis. And I think that because the author intended it to be a poem, there are a lot of things that are missing. We can move on to a little bit further in Genesis. This is one of the most common stories that was used many years ago. Now, a lot of conservative Christians don't use this verse anymore to combat homosexuality. Um, it is Genesis 19:4-5, which states, "But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all of the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, 'Where are the men who came to you last night? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them.'" Many of you probably know this story. It's a very, very popular story in the Bible. So essentially, God here is sends two angels disguised as men to the city of Sodom, where the men of Sodom threaten to gang rape them. The angels then blind the men, and God later destroys the city. For centuries, the story was interpreted to show God's judgments on same-sex relations. But the only form of same-sex behavior that is described in the story is threatened gang rape. And so I don't know about you, but I would consider gang rape as being a not good thing. It is inflicting violence. Um, and at that time, gang rape was actually used by men to other men as a common war tactic. And so it brings about violence and humiliation upon the receiver. And so this type of act had nothing to do with same gender relationships, but rather um, to force shame and humiliation on the receiver. So a lot of folks who were prisoners of war would have had this done to them. And then we see this in the story where the men come to Lot and tell him to bring out the angels so that they may threaten them with gang rape. The focus here in this story is violence, essentially, and the lack of hospitality instead of the act of two men having sex, which I wouldn't even consider sex because rape is not sex, it is violence. And so this passage actually gave birth to the English term sodomy, which I know many of you are probably familiar with. And so sodomy was believed to be referencing male homosexual sex acts or anything that is not procreative. So any sexual acts that are not procreative. Even though throughout history people use the story of Sodom against homosexuals, the Bible clearly states why Sodom was destroyed. In Ezekiel 16:49, the Bible highlights saying, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy." So we see here that even throughout history, people use this verse to condemn homosexuality because that's why Sodom was destroyed. Um, But later we see Prophet Ezekiel saying, no, Sodom was destroyed because they were arrogant and they were unconcerned with the poor and the needy. They were not hospitable. And so that was the reason why Sodom was destroyed, not because they were having gay sex. So that's some of the verses in Genesis. The next two I'm going to put together. This is in the book of Leviticus. I know many of you are very familiar with this one. This is probably the most common quoted one. So I'm going to read out Leviticus 18:22, which says, "You shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination." And then later on, 2 chapters later, we see Leviticus 20:13, which then states, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." So these two were probably the most explicit, and they're hard to kind of fight against. I think from a word standpoint, it clearly states men having sex with men. I'm not going to deny that, but we have to think about the context and the history of why these verses were put in the Bible in the first place. So, for me, for my response to this is that God wanted to make Israel a holy or set apart place was different from all these surrounding nations. And these surrounding nations were worshiping other gods such as Molech or Baal, and those who were worshiping those gods were doing stuff such as killing babies or putting them sacrificing their own children. They're also having gay and or straight sex in the streets to please the god and give them fertility or rain. They're also getting things like tattoos, and there's many other examples that I can give you. But those were kind of the things that the surrounding nations were doing, and what God wanted to do was create Israel to be separate and set apart from all of those nations. And so the whole book of Leviticus is a list of rules. It's a very boring read. So if you haven't read it, don't bother. It's super boring. If you ever want to have any questions about it, I'd love to chat with you about it. I personally like reading it. I like the history of it. Um, but there's so many other laws in Leviticus that do not get any attention. So we see that um, there are a lot of laws that Christians do not follow, such as wearing clothes with two threads, eating shrimp, letting your hair become unkept, going to church within 33 days of giving birth to a boy, or trimming your beard. These are all examples of rules that are listed in Leviticus that God um, put down for Christians to follow and be different and holy in comparison. So for me, I find it strange that these two verses about men having sex with men are plucked out and glorified to be a way bigger deal than the whole book, and are seen to be the only laws in the Leviticus that are followed. Furthermore, I would also say that with the coming of Jesus, we are made holy in his death and resurrection. And as Christians, we are no longer obliged to follow the Torah in order to be saved. The Old Testament is understood to show Christians that we are in need of Jesus because we are unable to attain that salvation on our own by following those rules. Those rules were meant to be so out there that it was impossible to follow. Um, and that was why Jesus had to come, is that humans could not physically follow all those rules in order to be saved. It was the need of Jesus to come do that for us. And so as Christians, we are no longer obliged to follow those rules, but they are a great history lesson to show us why Jesus was so important. So those were the first three that are explicit, including Genesis 1:27. So those four are the only verses that are talked about in the Old Testament. So now we're going to move on to the New Testament. There's uh, three that are talked about. And they all come from Paul, the Apostle Paul. The first one is, I think, the most common one that we see is Romans 1:26 to 27. And so this reads, "For this reason, God gave him up to degrading passions. For women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women. They were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error." So for any of you that are gay women or identify as lesbians, this is the only one that refers to women. So you're not out of the loop just yet. Um, for me, my response to this verse is that in biblical times, same-sex behavior was primarily seen happening between adult men and adolescent boys, first off. It was also seen to be happening between masters and servants, and it was also seen to be happening either through prostitution or with men who are already married to women, and vice versa, women who are already married to men. In all of those cases, we can see why this would have been seen as sinful. It would have shown the excessive lust and lustful acts of sex that were against God's law, such as having sex with adolescent children, having sex with someone that you have power over, prostitution, and then also already being in a committed relationship exclusively, and then going ahead and having sex with other people. Not that that's wrong, only if it's consented, of course. Um, and so all of these acts are excessive and lustful, yet Paul makes no mention of the love and committed and faithfulness of the type of same-sex relationships that we see today, or in the question of debate around marriage. Also here, Paul was not condemning the expression of same-sex orientation as opposed to the expression of opposite-sex orientation. He was rather condemning the excess of sex rather than just the moderation of sex. So for me, I see that Paul's main argument here is rather idolatry. So this means that what is at the core is the abandonment or exchange of heterosexual um, sex versus homosexual sex. So he was referencing to men and women who were naturally heterosexual, changing their heterosexualness to engage in homosexual acts. And so that was what he was referring to, is that giving up of your own identity and pursuing another one. So some folks have argued that Paul here is actually, I guess, approving of same-sex relationships. If I myself was gay, I would naturally be gay, and so for me, being forced into a straight relationship would be the same type of idolatry that Paul is condemning. And so some theologians use that argument as well. One of the most I find the most fascinating part of this one is that Paul references this idea of natural versus unnatural. And that's why a lot of people like to bring up Romans 1, because it's a lot more explicit that way. It talks about this idea of natural and unnatural. And so a lot of people bring in the idea of reproduction, the natural symmetry of penis and vagina, those kind of things. But for Paul, if we look at the history of kind of the way that he used the words natural and unnatural in this letter and in various letters that he's written, we see that in the ancient world, this meant that men and women had certain sexual roles. So roles, keep that in mind. Men held a natural active role in sex, and women held a natural passive role in sex. Again, these are historical. Obviously, that's not the case. Um, People have their own kinks. So at that time, if these roles were to be switched, it would have been unnatural. So here, Paul is actually referring to the social customs of sexual acts